Chapter 5 of Hunters Out of Space. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elliot Miller. Hunters Out of Space by Joseph E. Kelleam. Chapter 5. As the boat sped over the water, leaving a churning wake behind it, Jack Odin remembered that first sea voyage he had made on the seas of Opal. It was June time then, and Maya had been with him. Perhaps they had thought that June would last forever. Perhaps they had thought that all of life would go by at 5 miles per hour, remembering that slow, wonderful trip, almost like a voyage in a dream. He sighed as he held on to the skipping boat. They were now going well over 60. Gunnar seemed to sense his thoughts. "Wolden has ordered speed and more speed, my friend," he called over the roar of the motor. "The governors are all gone from the old machines. The smiths are turning out newer and faster ones all the time. Sometimes I think even the hands of the clock are going faster." Odin muttered a curse. What he had loved about this world was its leisure. What he had hated about his own world above was its constantly increasing speed. Like a squirrel caught in a cage, his world had gone faster and faster until reality had vanished into a mad blur of turning wheels and running feet. Oh well, he thought, a man is like a pup. Contented enough until life takes him by the scruff of the neck and shakes him up and proves to him that things change and a pup's world changes and he had better accustom himself to the new standards or be shaken up again. So they sped on through the low waves while the tower loomed nearer and taller before them. Gunnar was guiding with one hand while he talked into a little square box of gleaming metal. He turned his head and the boat careened into a trough that set it to shaking. "I have contacted Woden and Ato," he called cheerfully. "They are meeting us at the dock. Not the old dock. It's still underwater. The new one's farther up the street." As they neared Orthgard, Gunnar slowed the boat. Looking down into the murky water, Jack Odin could detect now and then the faintly traced shadow of a roof or a tower. Once as he looked down at a finely carved weather vane, a huge fangfish rolled between him and his view. A white belly gleamed through the water, and a serrated mouth opened wide. Its jaws bent out of proportion by the reflection of the water. It reminded Odin of the old story of the monster of chaos, rushing with gaping mouth to swallow the works of men. Then they were at the dock, which was scarcely a dock at all, but a place where the waters ended halfway up the sloping streets of the city. One thing had not changed. To the last, the people of Opal refused to take part in any governmental excitement. A car was there, a driver. Wolden was there looking much thinner and grayer. Beside him was his son Ato, inches taller and perhaps a bit thicker in the shoulders and a bit thinner in the waist. These were all. He had nearly broken his neck half a dozen times to get there, but Jack Odin was glad that the old idea had survived. Being reared so near to Washington, he had been puzzled for years over his country's mile-long processions and the spectacle of thousands rushing to watch a parade for some visiting celebrity or some current politician who would be forgotten before the next snow. He and Wolden shook hands. Odin was surprised at the change in him. When last seen, Odin had been a man just leaving the prime of life. Too much of a brain, perhaps, a bit too curious and a bit too fearful of the affairs of the world. But now the hand was weak, the face was thinner and grayer, although even nobler than it had been. But the eyes were sad and pained, as though they had seen too much and had dreamed dreams beyond the comprehension of his fellows. Somehow, Odin found himself remembering a lecture about Addison, who probably knew as much as anyone about the hearts of men, but upon being made second high man in his government could only stand tongue-struck in the presence of Parliament. Then there was Ato. The months had changed him too. He stood tall and lean, and there was a deep line running from each cheekbone down his face. He looked older, but his eyes were piercing now, while his father's were somber. Strife and hard work had sweated all the fat from his bones. He seemed much stronger than when Odin had first met him. But here was something more than strength. Ato had developed into a first-class fighting man. Wolden could never have been a fighter. There was something both terrifying and sad in the comparison. Ato looked like a man who could calmly send 100,000 to their deaths for one objective, while Wolden would have theorized and rationalized until the objective was lost. The old comparison between the impulsive executive and the liberal arts man who had learned that there are only one or two positive decisions available in all the world of thinking. But each in his own way was glad to see Odin and welcomed him back to the ruins of Opal. Then, just before the reunion was over, the clouds grew grayer and it began to rain. As they got into the little car, Wolden told Odin that they would have to circle the bay before going to the tower on a ferry, since the lower stories were still underwater. The city had once been beautiful with trees. Now they stood like giant skeletons, drowned by the seawater. Here and there, a few limbs struggled to put out their leaves. The rain was cold, colder than Odin had ever felt in Opal before. He shivered, but there was something more than the cold dankness of the air to make him shiver. Then they came to the ferry, and the ferryman was so old and bent that Odin looked twice at him to make sure he wasn't one-eyed. He wasn't. So the ferry creaked its way out to the tower, to an improvised landing just below the 6-story windows. They climbed through the windows into a huge room that seemed to be carved of fairy foam, and behind them the rain grew heavier and the thunder rolled in the distance and the lightning flashed like witch-fires across the jaded sky. 3 days had passed since Gunnar and Odin had returned to Opal. Dr. Jack Odin stretched out on a huge bed and felt the strength of his ultraviolet light upon the ceiling, pouring into his shoulders. In the next room, Gunnar was bathing and complaining about the seawater. Drinking water in Opal was now at a premium. Odin had been in the dumps. Now he was feeling better, although memory of the sodden ruins that he had seen in the last 3 days would never leave him. "And are you howling, my strong little man?" he called out cheerfully. "In Korea I once bathed in a mud puddle and enjoyed the bath." Gunnar's first few words were unprintable. "There was a river close to my house where the water ran silver once over the tops of the ford. And there Gunnar used to bathe. This is slop, Norse King. Nothing but slop." Odin laughed again. "You're getting old, Gunnar. Did anyone ever guarantee that ford would be for you always?" Gunnar, dripping water and with a towel wrapped around his middle, came dashing into the room. He stood there, his arms and shoulders flexed. "And does Gunnar look too old to fight?" he asked. Odin blinked. Gunnar's muscular development had always amazed him. The short man stood an inch less than 5 feet. His chest and shoulders must have measured more than that. His muscles writhed like iron snakes as he moved. His biceps and forearms were those of a smith, which indeed Gunnar had been, for Gunnar had been many things. The huge torso slanted down to a narrow waist and hips. Then his short legs propped him up like carved things of oak. Gunnar had once killed a bull with one blow of his fist. He had once snapped a man's back across those bulging, stubby thighs. Gunnar disappeared in search of fresh clothing. Odin lay there, thinking of all the things he had seen since returning to Opal. Although the water level was still high up on the tower, the lower floors had been made watertight and had been pumped dry. On his first trip to the tower, Odin had little chance to survey the rooms. Now he knew something of what Opal had lost. Curtains, paintings, rugs, statues, the finest furniture. All these had been ruined or damaged by the flood. Each room of the tower had been a work of art. Both bronze and Neeblings had contributed to it, back in the days when they were working shoulder to shoulder. In spite of his thoughts for Maya, he could not help thinking that the bronze had brought this on themselves. When they tried to put the Neeblings in second place, that was when the bell had sounded. Even so, why had the splendor been reduced to ruin? Oh, there were jewels that could be salvaged, and statues. But the tower was a work of art from top to bottom. The finest lace, china as thin as paper, paintings, these were gone. One might as well salvage Mona Lisa's eyes and swear they were the original. Higher up, where the water had not reached, the machines had been stored along with other treasures. But Opal's best had been waterlogged. And the trip that Odin had made with Wolden into the tunnel, that was the most heartbreaking of all. The Brons and the Neeblings had saved the treasures from the warring civilizations of the world above. The statues could be preserved. Some of the machines might possibly be restored. But the paintings, the art, and the books, all gone. Wolden especially mourned a Navajo sand painting, which he compared to Goya. Not a trace was left of it. Wolden had taken him into the tunnel, just as he had once before. It was dripping now, and the sound of the pumps throbbed through the ruins like the struggling heart of a wounded thing. Their little car moved slowly down the old tracks. Occasionally it had to stop, where some disintegrating pile of treasures had spilled out. One sack of diamonds had broken. Wolden stopped and kicked the stones away. An ancient Ford, with its back seat piled high with rotting and sprouting stacks of prize-winning oat seed, was both heartbreaking and ludicrous. The Brons and the Neeblings had been the true antiquarians of the world, and they had taken centuries to gather their collection. A dinosaur skeleton stared at them. The savage carved prow of a galleon leaned against the gaping whale's jaw. A model of the first atomic pile supported a score of leaning spears, but the feathers and artwork on those spears were now stains and shreds. An English flag, delicately embroidered, drooped beside the dripping tatters of the Confederacy. A Roman eagle was lifted high beside the crudely beautiful banner of the Choctaws, on which Odin could barely make out the 3 arrows and the unstrung bow. Chinese vases, thin as eggshells, most of them broken, lay in a tumbled pile beside ancient cradles and spinning wheels. A Neanderthal skull was staring hungrily at a 12-foot skeleton of a giant bird, and a restoration of a tiny little Equus was looking up like an inquisitive mouse at a huge, ruined painting by Rosa Bonheur. Thousands upon thousands of relics of the world above, some taken from the jetsam of the sea and others taken by exploring parties from Opal during those long glad years when the inner world was as comfortable as Eden and almost as happy. Gems by the millions, gold and silver coins, trappings inlaid with diamonds, furs, silks, bone instruments and ivory carvings. A Stradivarius was warping apart, and a Gutenberg was swollen to twice its size, its moldy pages curling away from the parent book. The books had fared worse. Great stacks of leather-covered libraries were turning into moldy, starchy mounds. Papyrus and lambskin scrolls were falling apart. Once, when they stopped for Wolden to thrust some moldy folds of Hindu thread of gold weaving from their path, Odin stopped and picked up the cover of a book. It was soggy and faded, but he could make out the title. Poems by a Bostonian. So they had gone on, but slower now than on their first journey into the tunnel which led to the floor of the gulf. An odor of dankness and decay hung over everything. The air was cold and damp, and everywhere were the footprints and handprints of Death, who had spared this galley for so long, but who had come back with his flashing scythe to claim his own. The stinking carcass of a hammer-head shark, washed in by the flood, lay sprawled across the sodden sarcophagus of an Egyptian princess. And a gloomy sickness fell upon Jack Odin there in the tunnel, as he thought of all the splendor that had died there, and the ages and ages of sweat and blood that had gone into these treasures. 1,000 treasures were trying to whisper their stories to him, but the dripping water was drowning them out. Thousands of men, some slaves and some kings, were trying to tell him what the jewels and books and swords and cradles had meant to them, but the drip, drip, drip of the water choked the echoes of their voices. The darkness that was ever crowding in seemed to be filled with the shadows of beautiful women in their fine laces, with flashing jewels about their throats and pendants brushing their half-covered breasts. They were trying to smell out of the dank, but a cold fog was creeping from the walls of the tunnel, settling above the shadows and driving them back, farther and farther, into all-pervading nothingness. Seeing his misery, Gunnar had clenched Odin's arm. "These were things of the past, Nose King. and the things of the past belong to the old dragon. Let us not complain if he has taken them at last. We have things to do, and we cannot do them if we are sick at heart. Did I tell you that 4 of my children died in the flood?" The voice of the broad-shouldered dwarf sounded husky and far away. "No, Gunnar, you never told me indeed, my old friend. I am sorry. Very sorry, and am ashamed that I sit here mourning the past and forgetting your troubles." "Yes, they died. My Frida and the other 3 are coming here, and we will eat at the same table again, and I will tell them that their grandsire and their great-grandsires were men among men, and that Gunnar himself has often sat high at the councils. Then we will go out to find Grim Hagen, and Frida and the 3 will go back to rebuild the farm. For that is the way of things, and as long as there are strong ones left to rebuild, Loki cannot altogether destroy us." The car moved slowly forward. The dismal fog grew heavier, until at last they came to the place where the old ship had stood. Now there was a new ship taking form within its huge cradles. Lights were everywhere. The red lights of the forge, the blue lights of the welding torches, the white light of the workbenches. The yellow lights that surrounded the high scaffolds went up and up to the top of the hourglass figure.
"This is our second," Walden explained. "Our first was much smaller. We had been working on a smaller model long before Grimhagen got ambitious. Some of our scientists have already gone into space. We are in touch with them. They went quietly and noiselessly. There was no need for all the destruction and havoc that Grimhagen worked. But this model is larger even than the old ship, and all the improvements that we once dreamed of are here. You see, Odin," Walden continued, "the old ship was ours for centuries. We of Orthgard have exploring minds. We went over the ship thousands of times. We knew where every bolt and pin was located. We improved it. In the beginning, when it brought our ancestors here, it must have been comparatively slow. But during the past 40 years, we learned much from your scientists about space. Einstein was the only thinker in a century gone mad from bickering. About 10 years ago, we perfected what I call the fourth drive. It would take days to explain it, but it can throw a ship into trans-Einsteinian space. We had equipped the old ship with the new invention. Our experimental drive was so equipped, and this newer, larger one will also have the fourth drive. But we have made a few improvements at the last."
It was all too deep for Odin, and there was so much to see that he did not ask any questions. Workers and smiths were everywhere. They crawled over the scaffolding like ants. They hammered and pounded at the framework. They were bent over furnaces and anvils. The presses and shapers were pounding away. Never before had Jack Odin seen so much activity in Opal.
"We are wrecking our building for this ship," Walden warned. "Given time, my experiments would have made worlds and space unnecessary. But it has been voted that we go after Maya and punish Grimhagen. Even though we drive to the edge of space, so be it. We are now building in weeks what would have once taken years to do. Those on our experimental ship who have already gone out into space, they have helped us immensely. Daily they report the results of their tests to us. The good points, the bad ones, the improvements. Oh, when this is finished, it will be a greater ship than we ever dreamed of. I did dream of such a ship when I was young. Now I find I do not want it. Even so, I will go out among the stars. Walden was never a coward, nor his fathers before him."
"So be it," Odin answered, and he leaned his head back and looked high up at the scaffolding where the welders' torches flashed like stars. "So be it, Walden. But I would have gone anyway." And Gunnar spoke.
"I would have gone beside you. My sword is thirsty."
High up on the hourglass shape, a bit of magnesium caught fire and burned brilliantly for a second, its sparks flashing out and down. A worker, who was no more than a shadow, smothered the flame. The sparks drifted downward like lost suns, seeking a course that they could find no more. They sparked and burned. Then they winked out, and there was nothing left upon the scaffolding but lancing flames and scurrying shadows. All about them now, the smiths were beating out old chaities on the ancient anvils and the newer clashing machines. End of chapter 5.